So I'm going to not try to do these a comprehensive overview. Other people have done a great job, especially Melissa leading us off with 5 really comprehensive questions. So I decided to come in perhaps at I don't know if it's a big question or a sub-question, but what I'm finding I'm still struggling with is to understand what's distinctive about the phenomenon that we're facing. And so in thinking about that, like, if this, as Melissa said, there's already some maturity to this debate, but I say as object is still, dispersed in terms of what actually is the distinctive aspect of the phenomenon that we are interested in. And it strikes me that one useful way of framing this is in terms of a rush, like a land rush rather than a grab. I understand that grab has a useful polemical purpose, but what's really distinctive about the phenomenon, I think, is the boom, the rush, the scale, and the reach of it all, rather than the mechanisms and processes, or even the impacts, all of which have a much longer history. So if we think about this in terms of land rush, then I think what it does is it puts it in a series with other rushes, other land rushes, the scramble that Sam referred to, also with gold rushes, crop booms, those kinds of instances which have the characteristic feature that they're spectacular, sudden, large-scale, visible, hyped, in which there's a sudden interest in a particular resource or a crop because of its newly discovered or enhanced value and the riches that it promises to investors who get into the business early. Hence the rush, right? There's a rush. And you have to get into this now before others got the value and the profit margins decrease. Fund managers apparently call this the first mover advantage. So obviously in my, this little aspect of this, I'm going to focus on the kind of private investment angle, because I think that's, of course it's not the whole picture, but it's one of the fascinating elements. How did land suddenly become this amazingly valuable thing that everyone needs to rush into because spectacular profits can be made there? So according to the reading that I've done on this, but mostly from the Journal of Peasant Studies, there's been a couple of excellent articles on the who are the investors, and it seems that private investors are the majority, although there was an initial concern about governments and so on, but private investments, whether they're directed by corporations or by funds, which are drawing in capital not only from big pension funds and so on, but also from small investors. So I started going to websites, just Googling, land investment, and it's remarkable the number of funds which are producing images of spectacular profits that anyone with a few $1,000s to invest in such a fund can make. So in that sense, I think it is in a series with, the tulip boom in the Netherlands in the 17th century, gold rushes, and other such ventures. So I think to think about this aspect, like why the rush, why the boom, why the sudden interest in land, it is useful to go upstream, as Melissa put it, to examine really the discursive moves which are necessary to create land as, first of all, valuable, secondly, limited and scarce, and thirdly, poised to rise rapidly in value. Something that you just can't lose if you get into land. And I think we also need to examine the inscription devices which make land investable, and that's the thing I'm going to talk about this afternoon. But in terms of the spectacular element, how a spectacle is produced, Melissa said this is a kind of an ethnographic project. I'm an anthropologist, so maybe I thought, in this gathering, this is what I could draw upon. But I'm thinking of the work done by fellow Indonesia scholar Anna Singh on her analysis of the Briex mining scandal. I don't know if any of you have read this. It's a wonderful article called Inside the Economy of Appearances. But what she examined was an event in which a small Canadian mining company claimed to have discovered fantastic gold reserves deep in the Borneo jungle. And investors flocked to buy this stock, pushing the... But the interesting question, and the thing that Anna's really trying to understand, is why the claim was plausible. Why would anyone believe that such a find was possible and could produce such amazing riches? So as she shows, that conjuring the plausibility of this kind of a find required the stock promoters to emphasize, first of all, the deep, dark loneliness of the jungle, and to overlook the presence of thousands of artisanal miners who'd been working for decades in the area and knew very well what was and wasn't there. It also called upon, as she points out, the Canadian tradition of frontier investment, especially in mining, the cultural myth of the lucky find, the idea that being bold and early can bring huge rewards. And as she explains, Canadian companies called mining juniors routinely rely on conjuring this kind of spectacle in order to draw in capital. Capital in hand, they then can go out to see whether they can actually find anything. So there is a sort of routine conjuring trick involved in drawing the capital in before you then get serious about actually locating gold, let alone establishing a mine. So if we take this kind of thinking and transfer it to the land rush, then I think the question of how these private investment companies are able to draw in funds, like what really is the magic? What's the equivalent of stumbling onto untold gold reserves in the middle of the Borneo jungle? And I think, so looking at the narratives, looking at these websites and how they're presenting at these, first of all, I would say the key kind of communicative device is the graph. So graphs like this, like rapidly rising population, spectacularly rising. Number of undernourished people in the world, using authoritative sources, the UN and so on. This one I think is marvelous. This is showing the inverse relationship between rapidly rising population and rapidly declining agricultural land area, due to urban sprawl and loss due to climate change, etc., etc. So basically, this kind of graph, I think its significance should not be underestimated in terms of the work it does to actually conjure a way of thinking and seeing things. Now we know that population and food needs actually increase gradually rather than spectacularly. And yet it is possible to conjure the possibility of such a spectacle using these kinds of instruments. So what do the narratives, how do they account for these spectacular gap between what land is currently worth, what it's going to be worth, and whether it's used for food or other purposes? Not so easy as stumbling on gold in the rainforest, right? Because it's bound to be a more complex narrative. So what accompanies these graphs then is, on the one hand, a narrative about rising consumption in India and China, like we heard some of those things. But I would say that the most spectacular one was actually provided by our friends at the World Bank, and I've just kind of copied part of this, but it's what they call the yield gap. Right? And to actually inscribe that graphically and to show to anyone interested in looking at it, this huge gap between the potential of this land and what is actually producing, like, whoa, now there's a game I want to be investing in, because clearly there's a fortune to be made, right? And so I think we should pay attention to, or learn from our friend, and if I can find it here. Sorry, I wanted to click something. A second. Okay, I can't find the quote. But I wanted to quote from our friend Michel Foucault, who basically argues that to pay attention to discourses, because, as he says, they're not just words, they're not just images, they are vehicles for, they have effects, right? They have effects as in schemes for the evaluation of things, ways of thinking and acting follow from discursive practices such as these. And in the case of the global land rush, I think that inscription devices and ways of conjuring urgency and profitability are very striking. So in why then Africa? Well, obviously because the conjuring trip is at its most extreme. That the gap is the largest, and some of these investment companies are promising profits of an annual return of 25%. Now, I don't know anywhere you can put your money and make 25% per year, but apparently you can with security in Africa. Then why would you believe that? Because of this whole discursive apparatus which is in place behind it, conjuring that possibility and making it seem plausible. So my question, I think, I don't know if I probably have failed in the mandate of asking the question, but I think what's something important for us to think about is if we're going to have a distinctive object in terms of this gathering, now and in the future, like what would be the element of its distinctive object of inquiry? And so I'm proposing this upstream element of what actually creates a land rush, why a land rush, as part of that picture, and something which I think should
frame our interest, and I think actually several of the panelists pointed to that upstream end as much as to the, the downstream consequences, which the contours of which are much more familiar to us than this element.